Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Testing. I'm Laura. I'm a park ranger with the Metro District. Welcome to Family Farming and Fermentation. We got several speakers tonight when you're going to learn a lot about the history of the area. And then, of course, at the very end, we'll get to sample some of the beer and cheese. I just wanted to introduce a few people. This is David. He's with the Highlands Ranch Historical Society. And then myself. And then with Whole Foods, we have Colin. He'll be doing the cheese. And then from Grist, we have Nate. So if you guys have any questions throughout the program, it's going to be pretty relaxed. So just feel free to ask questions, or if you want to know something. Like I said, it's going to be pretty chill. We still have a few people showing up. So if anybody wanders in, we'll just welcome them to the program. So I'm going to turn it over to David. And like I said, he's going to give a brief talk of family. I'll be doing farming, and then we'll get to the fermentation.
All right. Well, as I kind of go through and start talking about some of the family that was around here and a little bit of the history of the cheese ranch, one of the things I'm going to be doing is I have some pictures. I'll show them up here, and then I'll pass them around so that everybody can see them. They're not big posters, so you're not going to be able to see them all the way from your seats. So probably the biggest person tied in with the cheese ranch is John Welty. And if you actually look at how he spelled his name, it almost looks like Joanne whenever you look at it. Johannne, but a lot of times it was more like John is how it's been pronounced. So John Welty, and he moved here from Austria to America in 1867 and moved up to the Denver area in 1872. There he met up with Placido Gassner, and together they homesteaded the first 160 acres right here. And this is where they started everything. And they immediately established a dairy ranch on this site. So this is where they got started. In 1878, John married Teresa Berlinger. And from the very beginning, what you get with John and the whole ranch out here was a big social area. So first, here's a picture of John hanging out with his beer in hand. Of course, you got to have your beer. And you'll notice that in a lot of the photos coming up here, is there is beer in hand in many, many photos.
Right.
So the other thing you also notice a lot is just the gathering, just the number of people that you have around. Is even in some of these early photos from before the turn of the century, you see groups of dozens of people.
Right here. Those are from right here?
From right here.
From right here in this location.
And did they grow the hops here?
I don't recall if hops was on the list. Maybe someone else knows if hops is here, but I know they grew all sorts of stuff. They had orchards, they had livestock, they had hogs and poultry and orchards and dairy. And so they farmed in all sorts of different fashions. And I believe Laura's going to talk more about the farming, the building, and some of that stuff coming up here in a minute. And then in this final photo that's going to come around, this shows you a huge group of people all together. But one of the things that Nancy was pointing out to me right before this meeting is if you look back in the corner up here, you see some people clanging beers, holding beers, pointing at beers. They all have their beers with them back there in the corner of the photo. So as this one comes along, take a detailed look at all of it. And you have John Welty is down here in the middle with his wife right next to him. And at this point, we calculated that he would have been age 54 for this photo.
So this was party central, as is obvious. They've got their musical instruments and their fancy clothes, and beers are everywhere here.
Yeah, and so we just made mention that in 1878, John Welty married Teresa, and then in 1879, John and Gassner officially established this as the Big Dry Creek Cheese Ranch, and they expanded into hogs, poultry, orchards. They purchased some additional land at that time for $700, right here. It continued to. The survey in 1880 showed that there were 11 people actively living at the ranch. There was Placido Gassner, his wife Mary, who was 30 at the time, their daughter Emma at age 5, and their daughter Bertha at age 2 months. In addition, you had John Welty that was living here. He was 36. His wife was 34, and he had a daughter, Emily, that was 1 year old at the time. So you had kids, you had adults. In addition, there were at least 4 more boarders or ranch hands that were also living here that weren't specifically identified. In 1883, Placido Glasner dies, and his widows retain her shares. And then in 1906, they increased the size of the ranch. Jump forward. Yep, I'm going to this one. So in 1906, they increased the size of the ranch to 3,380 acres. That's about 5 1/4 square miles that the ranch was. The rough outline of the ranch, and this one has it with today's roads. Because of the way homesteads were, it would have actually been a square location. And so, but talking to the people that knew about the ranch, they said the roads are roughly where it was. Now, Colorado Boulevard, at least the straight portion of Colorado Boulevard coming down from County Line Road, that was right on the boundary of some homesteads. And that was the old territorial trail that used to go down, and it used to go straight into Daniels Park Road. When the developers came in the 80s, they're the ones that started bending all the roads and twisting the roads, just so people can't commute straight through Highlands Ranch as easily as they commute through other communities. And that was actually by design. They didn't want people going through Highlands Ranch. They wanted people either coming to or going out of Highlands Ranch, but not just driving through it as commuters. But as you can see the northern boundary was about County Line Road. The eastern side, if you follow Quebec, all the way down to MacArthur Ranch Road, and then over to where Wildcat in Colorado Boulevard. So if you were to draw a straight line in through there, that's where the western side would be. And so that was expanded, and that would have been 1906. And then in 1908, Glasner's widow sells out the remainder of her shares to John Welty, and he takes up full ownership. In 1911, so not very long after that happened, just 3 years later, John Welty actually deeded the Big Cheese Ranch over to his son-in-law, Philip Renner. Now, Philip Renner had been working around in the area, and he had actually worked down at the Tivoli Brewery. So we got a picture of Tivoli Brewery. And there is John Renner, second from the end, working at the Tivoli Brewery. So those...
Another beer connection.
Yep, yeah, another beer connection.
Yeah.
And here is one of his cheese wrappers. This cheese wrapper they actually have down at the History Research Center in Castle Rock. Is where the actual wrapper I believe exists today. But it actually, if you can see the early cheese wrapper, actually has a photo of the cows, and it talks about Philip Renner and the Big Dry Creek Ranch. And apparently Philip Renner had a very good reputation as a cheese manufacturer out in this area. And one of the other ones that Nancy was just telling me right before this is that apparently the Big Cheese Ranch actually sold a lot of their products up toward Littleton, whereas the Griggs that were just south of MacArthur Ranch Road, they sold a lot of their stuff down towards Sedalia and in the other direction. So, interesting that they kind of separated it there. So I'll pass those around. All right. And then after he deeded away his house, John Welty lived for another 16 years, and in 1927 he passed away, and is currently interned up at the Littleton Cemetery. So, in 1930, some of the kids that were out here, it shows them lining up at the schoolhouse. In the schoolhouse, according to the story, according to what we've heard and what I remember seeing as a kid, is there used to be a little white building, probably about this size, right along the territorial road at Colorado Boulevard. I know Nancy was asking me exactly where I remember seeing it as a kid, and my remembrance of a kid was it was about halfway between County Line Road and the Bluffs. As a kid, that's about as accurate as you get.
So we think it was probably like at the entrance to Province Center. And right there, right off of the entrance, there's a Montessori or some kind of a school. So it was somewhere right in there, about a mile from County Line. So every time I drive past, I keep looking for it. Haven't found it yet, but David remembers it.
I just remember the little white building that was right along the side of the road, and looking at the picture, that's about what it looked like. So it would be your one-room schoolhouse that would have been out here. Going on from there, in 1938, they actually closed down the active part of the cheese ranch, and at the time, you could buy 3 5-pound blocks of cheese for $1. Yeah, 15 pounds of cheese for $1. And then in 1943, Lawrence Phipps Jr. acquired the land, and they continued to actually use the buildings that were on this property for quite a while as the East Ranch. So whenever they were dealing with any of their cattle operations or other operations that brought them over to the east side, they still continued to use the buildings and the structures out here as the East Ranch as they continued on. And then in 1985, Mission Viejo had acquired the land, and under Dr. Richard Carrillo and his staff, they did an archaeological survey of the ranch prior to demolishing it. And in the archaeological survey, they went through and they found beer steins.
Imagine that.
Beer steins were out here. Beer bottles were out here. They found beer caps from the Tivoli.
They also found wine glasses, but we didn't print any of those.
This was where they made the cheese. This was one of their cheese molds.
So this would have been like the 5-pound cheese mold.
And for the final photo that I have for my portion, Nancy found a Google Earth. Google Earth has history, and one of the things that, if you have never found this, that we're lucky in Douglas County, is the History Research Center down in Castle Rock has actually put aerial photographs throughout time of Douglas County up on Google Earth. So if you ever go to that time slider over Douglas County, there's a rich history of a lot of photos going back in time. In this one, looking at the little time slider at the bottom, says 1937, and it shows some of the fields around this area. The little green tree, I believe, is right about where we are now. So that gives you a reference point.
You can see the bend in the river, bend in the dry creek, and that's just right down here, just short little ways around. So we know we're right in the center of things.
Yep. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura to talk about more of the buildings.
Aren't you going to talk about your book? Hold on, David has one more thing to talk about.
Well, the other thing that Nancy's talking about is for the Highlands Ranch Historical Society, we did come out with a book about Highlands Ranch. It just came out August 1st. I'm the primary author, and we have a few copies if someone wants to buy it at the end. But that's not the primary goal of this meeting, so I'm not going to talk about it too much.
But we all hope you come back next Monday night to the Historical Society, and I have brochures over here if you want any, and David's going to do a full hour on the history of all of Highlands Ranch, not just the cheese ranch.
And actually, my focus in that hour is going to be actually going through the book and talking about some of the unique things of the photographs that I learned in acquiring them.
If anybody needs water, I'm going to leave this over here. Remember, no bathrooms. We'll just have to go in the whole world trays. Display. All right. Thank you. Alrighty, I'm going to try and do this double-handed. So on to the farming portion of this program. If you think about it, many, many years ago, the Arapaho and I believe the Cheyenne that lived in the area, they farmed as well. And they don't have many of the modern techniques that we have today. And even with Johann Welty, he didn't really have, expensive equipment. Obviously, irrigation wasn't a big thing back then. So he was really a pioneer in a technique called dry land farming, which, anybody have an idea of what that means? It's kind of in the name. What do you think?
It's where you don't irrigate.
Right.
Just let it rain or not.
Yep. So basically using the water that you get from natural ways, so from rain, snow, that sort of thing. So he was actually a pretty big pioneer in that. And you can actually dry land farm with as little as 9 inches of precip a year, which I think is pretty amazing. Dry land farming started kind of around the 1880s, and it got really, really big kind of around World War I, when the U.S. was a big supplier of wheat to Europe. And we tend to get droughts every 20 years in the Great Plains. And Johann Welty had to be super, super adaptable. So basically using only the water that he got, he was actually a super successful farmer. I know that David mentioned some of the stuff that he grew out here. In 1906, the Scientific Farmer magazine actually wrote about Johann Welty and some of his techniques that he used just because it was so successful out here. And the ranch was actually pretty successful until about the 1930s, and that's when the Great Depression happened and the Dust Bowl and that sort of thing. But David did mention that this ranch started off at 160 acres and then grew to 3,380, which I think is amazing. I mean, that's giant. So, some of the things that Johann used out here, and if you think about it, I don't know much about farming, and I don't know if anybody here is a farmer, but there's three kind of big things, and they all are kind of similar techniques. We got harrowing, we've got tilling, and we've got kind of like raking almost. And if you think about it, everybody knows what a plow is, right? Plows, farmers use plows, Welty used plows, and that's actually a machine that's actually going to make super deep. You guys think about a plow from growing up. It actually is tearing up the earth. It's making really, really deep holes, if you want to call it, or areas for the seeds to be planted. And then harrowing is actually something that's done after plowing, and it almost kind of breaks up those big chunks that the plowing makes and actually kind of makes it a little bit smooth. So he did a lot of that. He did a lot of harrowing and tilling, and then he also was a big user of crop rotation, which, if you know anything about farming, it helps to kind of rotate your crops every certain amount of years, and that just kind of helps the nutrients in the soil, and sometimes it's also helpful to leave one of those areas empty, and that way the soil can kind of build up different nutrients and that sort of thing. I'm going to do a little demonstration here, and hopefully it works, but I only have one hand. I might put this microphone down. Okay. I'll try and talk loud. So this is my example of kind of what tilling and harrowing is all about. So if you think about my cookie sheet here as the earth or the soil, and then if we think about these sponges as the subsoil, which is underneath the topsoil, right? If it were to rain, what happens? Alright, so it's not staying on the topsoil, right? It's soaking into my subsoil, which is where it's going to stay. And then I mentioned that tilling kind of almost smooths it out, which is almost a way of sealing in that moisture. If you think of it as saran wrap, sealing in that moisture. But then what happens when I till or harrow or plow? What's going to happen? It goes down deeper, and that water is being pulled up to the surface, right? It's not really working with my fork. But if you get the idea of breaking up that soil, getting down in there where that moisture is actually still kind of holding on. And again, that's just water from rain, snow, and that sort of thing. So he was actually pretty good at all those crops, and that's just kind of to show you a little bit how that works. And I also have some pictures. Where's Vanna? Let me put this down. So I have a picture here of what a harrow looks like. It almost looks similar to a plow, but it just doesn't go as deep as the plow does. So as David mentioned, lots of different things were grown out here at Cheese Ranch. Corn, wheat, alfalfa, hay, beets, barley, rye. And then as far as the orchard went, we had apple, cherry, plum, and peach trees. And if you look behind you, you'll notice that we do have some trees, what we're calling our orchard, our current day orchard out here, that actually is the same types of fruit that Johann had out here. Now, some of the structures that were out here We had the main house, which I will send those pictures around. We had the milking barn, cheese factory, the hog house, the slaughterhouse, poultry houses, granaries, which is where you store all the grain, the ice house, which, anybody know what an ice house is? Pretty, you guys are pretty smart. The bunkhouse, loafing sheds, coal shed, and a blacksmith shop. So obviously, no refrigeration back then. So in the ice house is where they kept the big chunks of ice that they were able to use to kind of keep some of their fruit and vegetables fresh. And they would collect that ice over the winter. Now, one question that you guys did ask earlier was, did he grow hops? We're unsure about that, but we actually have found wild hops growing out here. And we're not sure if it's the same strain that maybe Johann possibly planted. But if you walk along the Highline Canal in a lot of areas in Highlands Ranch, you'll see wild hops growing. And that's what the hops actually look like.
We actually tried to save the hops that we found. They're not doing well. They're kind of in intensive care, and they're not expected to survive. So we're calling them heritage hops.
Yes, that's Nancy's baby. Here's an old picture just of the farm, and if you look very closely in the back, you'll see the windmill, which looks similar to this windmill.
Is it the same one?
It is not the same windmill. A lot of the structures that were out here were pretty badly damaged, just because nobody was living in them, nobody was really taking care of them. They were just kind of weathered, falling apart. And I have pictures of what they look like. But in this picture, you can see the family home, which is this white house, and then the dairy barn, which is that big structure next to it.
Where would that have been in relation to where we are?
Is it on that map that you passed out?
That way?
I think I had a location of the buildings.
I'm not sure where exactly. We'll have to look that up. This is a closer-up picture of the family home. Looks nice and cozy. So the family home is the white house, the smaller white house. And now we have some more recent pictures. You can see this one where it's kind of starting to get a little dilapidated, but you can still see the family home.
Is this windmill where it actually was?
I don't believe so, but I think it's pretty close. So this windmill was replaced 2002, and it's actually very similar to the one that was out here. It's a 1927 Baker windmill. The purpose of the windmill was actually, for a while there, was aerating the pond, which the pond is just over here to the side. But now it's just mainly kind of a beautiful thing to look at. It makes it unique here in Cheese Ranch, but the pond is now actually, if you look back, you'll see a solar panel being aerated by that.
Have you determined where this road went to?
I have not, and I think it would be helpful if we had those Google Earth. Is it on that Google Earth? Okay. Oh, that's right. Do you want to show them that one again?
Yeah. So here's the Google Earth, and from 1937, so the buildings were still here. Here is the Dry Creek, which is right behind us here, and you can. This big bend is really a good landmark, because if you just walk down here, you'll see the Big Bend just right down here, and that's where we found the hops. Was right at the Big Bend. And isn't it interesting? Here's all kind of fields right at the Big Bend. So Laura may not believe, but I think it was a real hop. And right a little bit away from the Big Bend were all the houses, so right back here. And there's actually foundations. You can see a lot of, not a lot, but there are foundations behind these trees and all. So literally we were right in it. And their pond is just right on the other side here of all these trees. So they had their pond, the Dry Creek, and all their houses and all their barns right here. I'll pass this around again, just if you want to look at it again. It's kind of interesting.
Thanks,
So
Nancy.
we'll get this going this way.
So here's just, again, some more recent pictures. showing what the structures look like before they were removed. And from what I heard, they were having a lot of issues with maybe transients living inside of them. They were starting fires inside the building, so it was just kind of unsafe, and that's why they chose to not keep the buildings. And then here's just a recent day picture with the current windmill. So lots of changes over the years, and like I said, for him to just come here from another country, not really, knowing the area or how much precipitation they were going to get. I mean, it was a really successful farm for that time period. David also mentioned not only did he dry land farm, but he was obviously a big dairy farmer. So we'll move on to the dairy and let Colin, almost forgot your name, from Whole Foods, he'll give you a little brief fermentation talk on cheese.
Hello everyone, once again I'm Colin from Whole Foods Market just down the street. I'll be talking to you about the dairy history around this area, some of the cheeses that were made here, and some of the cheeses that you'll be tasting today. Historically, in the 1890s, all the homesteading and farming around this area attracted a large dairy industry. Your dairy is going to help essentially mow the lawn and fertilize. So within the 1890s, we've had about 17 different dairy type operations between milk producers and cheese facilities. By the 1920s, that number was up to the 70s. So almost quadrupled the dairy industry in this area. So the two main types of cheeses that were made here that we'll be talking about will be a traditional Limburger, a Bavarian style cheese, and a brick cheese, which is a few different interpretations of what a brick cheese can be, but it's essentially a American cheddar style cheese. With Limburger, it's traditionally a raw milk based cheese. Whenever you're making a raw milk based cheese, you have to start with the highest quality. If you don't start with high quality, you'll automatically end up with a poor finished product. Those raw milk cheeses are very sensitive, very temperamental, and if you don't take care of them, then they will turn on you. You can start getting all sorts of foreign bacteria and cultures that can sneak into the cheese, producing foul odors, tastes, anything from really strong dirt to plasticky rubber bands. So it's really important to start with your high quality raw milk when you make your Limburger. So historically here at the Cheese Ranch, when they would do their Limburger, they would only take the first milk of the day. It was kind of a time crunch to get the milk over to the cheese making facility before it reached too high of a temperature or before it was exposed to oxygen for too long. So, with all of that high-quality milk going straight to the cheese-making facility that could still maintain that high quality using the raw milk and have a really great product. However, as most of you know, when you milk an animal, you milk at least twice a day, so morning and evenings. So they run into an issue where they had an excess of milk because they could only use the morning milk for their Limburger. So to combat this issue, they started doing brick cheese. Brick cheese allows you to kind of use a blend of milk from your morning and evening milkings of the animal. The aging process just doesn't require as high of a quality, as high of tolerances in maintaining that cheese. It's a slower curing process, so you're not fighting those bad bacteria. It's not the race against the clock. Now with the Limburger, you really do want those cultures as part of the cheese making process. On the outside of your Limburger, it has this kind of stinky, tacky rind to it. That's actually formed intentionally by bacterial cultures. And it's a speed process. Again, it's that kind of race against the clock. You need that bacteria to help you form the rind so that those bad bacteria can't get inside of the cheese and spoil it. So you need to form that kind of protective shell. And one kind of fun note about that bacterial culture, it's called Brevibacteria linens. It's commonly found on nearly every human body and most foods. And it's what produces essentially your stinky foot odor. So armpits, stinky feet, socks, they remind you of Limburger. It's because it's produced by that same bacteria. It's producing that same odor. Another kind of interesting fact about that odor, mosquitoes are actually attracted to it. So if you're trying to stay away from those mosquitoes, either eat your Limburger inside or not in hot, swampy summer months. But moving on, going back to the brick cheese. The brick cheese it gets its name both because of the size and shape of the blocks that they came out with. They're roughly the size of a standard household brick. But bricks were also used in the cheese making process. For cheese making, you need to separate your curds and your whey. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. For Limburger, traditionally here on the farm, Limburger was poured into long molds that were laid in vertical tables, so they were angled to allow the whey to slowly run and drain off. With your brick cheese, they would actually place 1 to 2 bricks on top of your cheese to help press out that whey, and those would be flipped 2 to 3 times a day to help, again, push out all of that moisture. Now, as we talk about these different types of cheese-making processes, they're all done historically, traditionally, but they all come from ancient needs of survival. These softer, younger cheeses are really made historically to be eaten soon. We raise animals for the milk. We consume as much milk as we can, but are often left with extra milk. We use that milk to make cheese to eat later. However, sometimes we need an excess of our supplies to get through winter months. So some of our softer cheeses are really intended to be eaten almost right away. Then we move on to some of our brick-style cheeses that can be aged and held up and last through the winter. And then one cheese that we'll be tasting today is our 3-year Gouda. It's another style that's essentially your emergency reserve for your cheeses. Maybe you had a really good year this year. You know you'll make it through the winter, but you want to put aside a little extra maybe for next year in case the harvest or your crops aren't as good. So this kind of historical, natural desire to survive has helped shape the different directions that we head in with our cheeses. So, with that, we'll be trying a few different cheeses today. We do have a traditional Bavarian Limburger. Good and stinky on the outside, good and creamy, buttery on the middle. We'll also be trying it's Barber's 1833 vintage cheddar. That's one of the oldest continually made cheddars in existence. And then, again, to kind of round us out to show this full life of cheese, we have our 3-year Gouda. We'll start taking on some really savory caramel butterscotchy flavors. Really great. And just kind of going back, some little pieces of information here. These are some postings from the area while the dairy industry was booming. So we have here some dairy and cheese posters and flyers that were around the area, just to kind of show up. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask when you come up to grab your cheese. But I think I'll hand it over to Nate to talk about beer now.
Alrighty. Thank you, sir. All right, so let's talk about all this beer that we've dug up and found here, and all the steins and how they got here. So obviously, Highlands Ranch has a rich beer drinking culture. The beer producing culture is only 3 years old. We're the first production brewery in Highlands Ranch, Grist Brewing Company. We started 3 years ago in November, or actually in November, so it'll be 3 years in November. So the folks that were here at the Cheese Ranch actually worked at Tivoli, which is one of the older breweries in the state. As far as beer goes, it has a rich history. As far it is believed by a number of historians, now whether they can prove it or not is something else, that the nomadic tribes in the Middle East basically stopped and created civilization so they could produce barley for their beer. So they would actually, back then they would make barley bread and then they would soak the bread and ferment it. But modern civilization basically owes itself to the making of beer. So beer it is in every culture. It's made in many different ways. It's right here in the United States has gone through a renaissance in the last 15, 20 years as the craft beer industry has really kind of taken our concept of beer and thrown it on its head. But really, that's nothing it's really nothing new. Beer has been made in homes. It's been made in breweries. It's been made by pretty much any culture on the planet. And how it's made now is very similar to how it's been made throughout history. So what you start with is you start with barley. So I just reading over here, one of the plants that they had on the farm here was barley. Barley, you can start with barley. You can actually make beer with rice. You can make beer with many other grains. But barley is the most popular because through the malting process, you can get the most fermentable sugars out of barley as opposed to wheat, corn, and some of those others. So the barley will be grown, and then once they take it, they'll take the barley kernels and they'll bring it into a malting house where it'll be germinated. And once it gets germinated, you get as many sugars as you can possibly get in that little barley kernel. They'll take that and they'll kiln it. And what you'll get from there is they'll kiln it at different temperatures to get different colors of barley. But I'll pass this around. This actually I stole from a tiny brewery called Budweiser. Yeah, you can open it up and play with it. Yeah. So this is actually the base barley for Budweiser. They gave it at a talk at a conference I went to one time, and I just love to use it as a prop. So barley will be kilned, and at that point, it'll basically become this kind of hard, sweet. If you're brave, you can eat it. It's just kind of like a sweet little kernel. And some will be light. Those will be your base malts, and they'll get darker. And those will be malts that you'll use for stouts and some of the darker beers. So basically, once we have this beginning product, what we want to do is pull the sugar out of it. So the first thing when you walk into a brewery, and if you've ever been to Grist or if you've done the Coors tour, the first thing that they do is you go into something that's called a mash tun. And the mash tun is where they take all of this barley, they crack it in a grist mill, so it has to get broken up so you have more surface area. It goes up into a pot, and it's then also water at about a temperature of 162, somewhere in that neighborhood, depending on what type of beer they're making and how much sugar they want to pull out of it. They'll mix that 162-degree water with the barley, and then they'll soak it. And what's happening in that process is that's the right temperature for the enzymes that are on the kernels of the barley to activate and start to convert those, pull that sugar out of the kernel, and so and convert them into fermentable sugars. So there's a range, and it's roughly like 145 to 155 degrees that you want that actual mash temperature to sit at. So you go a little bit higher because the grain's going to soak up some of that temperature and bring your temperatures down. But it soaks in there, and about that range, at the lower the range, you tend to get more fermentable sugars, so that's going to be a beer with a little bit less body, a little bit higher alcohol content. The higher the range, you're going to get more body to the beer, a little bit less fermentable sugars. So it's just one of the levers that brewers use to make different recipes depending on the beer. So once you've pulled all that out, you're going to take that sweet liquid, it's called wort, W-O-R-T, and that goes into your brew kettle. And so your brew kettle will be, just like a giant pot. They just get bigger depending on the size of the brewery. At home, you can use a pot, and you can see our version of a pot over at Grist is 20 barrels large, which is roughly 40 kegs, standard kegs that it can produce. So all that liquid goes in there, and they start the boil process. And at that point, what you'll do with most beers is you'll start with your hops. And you want to put these in. You have to boil what's called your bittering hops early, because it takes a long time to pull the resins out of the hops, and that's what you taste on your tongue when you taste a bitter beer. So I'll pass these around. These are warrior hops. That's just a fun name. I just called warrior hops because I wanted to say warrior hops. But the so within hops, you have basically the resins and you have the oils. And the resins are going to be what you want to pull out early in the boil. You have to boil them for about 60 minutes to really pull those out. And different hops are used for that as opposed to later in the boil where you want to pull out the oils. Those are your aromatic hops. That's what you're going to smell when you drink the beer. So feel free with these as they're being passed around. Pick them up, squish them, smell them. They're going to smell very similar to their recently legalized cousin, which is marijuana. The two plants are very, very similar. And in fact, there are quite a bit of wild hops that do grow throughout this area. And hops are really easy to grow, but they're very hard to grow well because it's a weed. And it's been called a wicked and pernicious weed because once it gets in, it will take over. Now, if you're trying to make brewers hops for brewing, you have to isolate the exact ones you want with specific alpha acids and and oils and things that you want for the flavor of your beer. So getting back to the brewing process, so these ones you would probably stick in the beginning of the boil. You can use them for aromatics, but typically you're going to stick them in the beginning of the boil. So what that does, all the oils will boil off of those hops, and you'll just get the bittering on your tongue. So you get through your boil to the end, and in the last 20 minutes, depending on the recipe, you're going to throw more hops in. Now, you're not going to pull any resins out of those hops, only the oils, and the later you go, the more different compounds come out of there. So there's hundreds and hundreds of flavor compounds within hops, and they're still learning more and more about it. But the later you throw it in, the more of the smell you'll get off of that. So about 60 minutes on a typical beer, they'll cut the boil, and now you got to bring that beer down to a level that you can actually put yeast in it, which is the final and one of the most important ingredients to make beer. It actually, oftentimes brewers will say they make beer, but in reality it's yeast that makes beer. They're the ones that are responsible for it. So you got to bring it down below 100 degrees, and you have to do it fairly quickly within the brewing process. So they'll put that wort through a plate chiller and put it into the fermenter at that point and pitch the yeast. So there's two kinds of yeast, and I think this is where we often get this question to the brewery. This is probably where a lot of people get confused on different styles. Is there's an ale yeast and a lager yeast. And you can have ales that are dark, light, all sorts of different colors, and you can have lagers that are dark, light, all sorts of different colors. When someone says they want an ale or a lager, they're just referring to how it was fermented. So an ale yeast, you're going to ferment at higher temperatures, and it's going to ferment along the top of the beer. The lager yeast is going to ferment at lower temperatures, and it's going to sit on the bottom of the beer. Ale yeast is the original yeast because without fermentation and all the rest of it, that was the strain of brewer's yeast that they would use for centuries. Lager yeast came out of Germany, where they literally were, because of the hotter summer months, they would go into these caves, and they would, over courses of years, they'd ferment these caves until finally this yeast strain emerged that was able to ferment at colder temperatures inside these caves with ice and all the rest of it. It's kind of an interesting process that they found. But that's how lager yeast came to be known. And then the Germans went wild with it. They make predominantly lagers, almost exclusively in Germany. So for the beer that we're going to try today, it's an Oktoberfest, which luckily pairs with all the cheeses that you're going to have. That was actually a little serendipitous. But so the lager yeast will sit, and it takes longer to ferment and condition. Because the colder temperature, that slows down the fermentation process, but it also ends up with a beer that typically is a little bit smoother and a little bit less aromatic and a lot of really strong flavors and things like that. You're going to get an easier drinking beer typically with a lager. Most of the beers that we make at the brewery are an ale, and those are going to be a little bit sharper. Those are your IPAs, your pale ales, a lot of different beers that really have a sharp hop note to them because that yeast, it ferments at a higher temperature, is going to kick off more flavor. So the yeast will sit in there for different amount of times. You can ferment in a few days with certain ale yeasts, and you can ferment in weeks with a lager yeast. So depending again on the recipe, it'll sit in that fermenter for a little bit of time. Once the beer hits what they call their terminal gravity, that just means the alcohol level that they want for that style, they will cold crash that beer. So they'll put the yeast to sleep basically by turning on the chillers and making that beer cold, and now the yeast all fall to the bottom and go to sleep. Because they're going to reuse those. You can wake them up and send them to work and put them down. And what the yeast have been doing over that fermentation process is they're eating all those fermentable sugars. They're kicking out carbon dioxide and producing alcohol, as well as a lot of different flavors and other things that contribute to the beer, and either the good part of the beer or off flavors that you don't want. If you push your yeast too hard, you can get flavors that you don't want in a particular style. So the dialing them in is where the brewers really, that's where the sophisticated equipment comes into. And yeasts are very inconsistent. So the smaller breweries struggle with getting them to dial. So if they make a really good beer once, it's really hard to get your yeast to do that again. And that's where the big breweries spend most of their money, is on that consistency, is trying to get those yeasts to do the same thing twice. So once they have fermented it out, now you want to clarify your beer. They crash it down. They'll put, it's called they'll use a fining ingredient. Some places like Guinness will use actually an ingredient out of a fish bladder. Most places don't. They use either a gelatin or they use a biofine, which is just, it gets into the beer and it brings all that sediment down to the bottom so that you have a clear beer. So you're going to let that beer sit for a little while, and then you can do one of two things at that point, depending on how you want to carbonate it. Most breweries will force carbonate it. So they'll bring in big carbonation tanks, put it into the beer, let it sit, let that gas absorb into the beer, and now you have a carbonated beer. In England, there's what's been popular for a long time is what's called cask conditioning. Or if you're a home brewer, it's called bottle conditioning. And what you do is you add a little bit more sugar to that to your wort or your finished product, and then you put it in an enclosed container. So you can put it in a bottle or you can put it in a cask. The yeast will wake up again, they'll kick out a little bit more CO2, and that will give you enough carbon dioxide in that beer where you'll have a bubbly product at the end of it. That's a natural way to carbonate. It's a little bit more difficult, it's harder to regulate, but at the same time it does produce amazing smooth beers, especially if you've ever been to an English pub and had a beer off a beer engine, like a proper pour. It is very smooth and delicious. A lot of aromatics come off of that. So that's when you get to your finished product. Not all beers are made like that. Now with the craft beer movement and a lot of things, you can add all sorts of stuff throughout that. So it's not just yeast, hops, water, and barley anymore. You can add fruit, you can add spices, you can add herbs, you can add all sorts of stuff. And in fact, way back when, before hops became the predominant brewing ingredient, they would actually use herbs to make beer before they had hops. Using hops, they started using that because it's a superior preservative and it's also a superior bittering herb compared to some of the other ones they were using. So to the Oktoberfest that we're going to be trying today, the reason I brought that down is, one, it's in season. It is time for Oktoberfest if you were going to drink them. And the reason it is in season is an Oktoberfest is considered a Marzen-style beer. Marzen in German means March. And what they would do is they'd brew this style of beer because they weren't allowed to brew during the summer months. And so they'd have to brew it strong enough that it would survive through the summer months. And so the amount of beer at the end, when you get to the fall, whatever was left, they throw the Oktoberfest, and that's why it has those two names. So the Marzen you'll hear is the same thing as an Oktoberfest. We just call it that this time of year because this is when you're technically supposed to be drinking the rest of what you stored for the summer. So that's kind of a quick overview of the brewing process. If you have any questions, any detailed questions, I'd be happy to answer those. If not, I've brought a can of Oktoberfest for everybody. If you want a full can, you're more than welcome to. We also have cups if you want to share with somebody, however much you want. I've brought.
Where does yeast originally come from?
It's naturally occurring. So over time, they've isolated yeast strains that work better in beer, but you can actually make beer just from the air in just floating around. So there's a brewery that's up off Broadway called Black Project. And they have a number of beers that are made just literally from the yeast that's floating in the air above Broadway. So they take their beer and they cool it up on the roof and just let it sit there for wild yeast and everything to get in there, and they make beers out of it. And that's where a lot of your sour beers come from. They're from wild yeast, or bacteria is also something that can get into beer, just like cheese, and change the flavor for good or bad depending on the style.
What's the name of that brewery again?
Black Project. Yeah, they're a small brewery, and they do spontaneously fermented ales. And also, Crooked Stave is another one. But they have a wild cultured yeast. They've taken a yeast and cultivated it that's a wild yeast. But over years and years and years of making beer, the styles that we produce out of our brewery are brewer's yeast that are that have been cultivated in a lab, so you have that one yeast strain that you want that's going to make that style you want, so we can make beer as consistently as possible. They use a Brettanomyces yeast, so it might be originally from Belgium, or they may have pulled it actually from here in Colorado and then just use a lab to single it out. Any other questions on beer? Cool. Well, let's get to the fun part.
All right, I just want to say thanks to all of you for coming again, and big thanks to David, Colin, and Nate for sharing their love, their passion. So for those of you that don't know where Grist is, it's on Town Center, just east of Santa Fe, kind of in that shopping center there on the, I guess it would be the northeast corner. And then everybody knows where Whole Foods is, right? Just down the street. So something that I know Nancy mentioned the last time we had this program, which I thought was kind of interesting, was that families would actually make a day trip to come out here and eat the cheese and drink the beer. So today that would, take 30 minutes? And back then it was, horse and carriage all the way out here, spend the entire day enjoying the area, enjoying the beer and cheese, and then heading back to Denver. So it was a whole day excursion. So I'm going to let them set up a little bit. You guys are both good?
Time, yeah.
What do you need to do with those cans? I'm just kidding.
I'm just going to hand them.
Okay. So if you guys just want to line up, I'm sure Nate and Colin can answer any questions that you have regarding the beer and cheese. If you guys want water, again, I set it back there if you're not going to drink. And then, again, the Highlands Ranch history book is on this table, along with some information on the Historical Society, as well as some upcoming programs that the Metro District is offering. So any questions? Any other questions? You guys want to get rolling, right? Okay. So however you guys want to line up, don't push each other over. Take turns. Thank you.